The second session of the 2021 Ohio Beef Cattle Management School was hosted via Zoom by the Ohio State University Extension Beef Team on January 25th. During that second session, one focus of the evening was effectively utilizing plastic wrap for fermenting baled forages and making baleage. In the presentation that follows, Jason Hartschuh discusses harvest options, correct harvest moisture, and properly baling and wrapping wet forages. Let's listen in as the host, Extension Beef Field Specialist Garth Ruff, introduces Jason and his presentation on the do's and don'ts of making high quality baleage.
When we talk about making annual forages or some of these alternative forages, I think it's just fitting to follow that presentation with what Jason's going to talk about as far as making baleage and storing that product, feeding that product, because a lot of times we can't get those annual forages, especially those summer annuals, dry enough to make dry hay. There are some exceptions. So I'm going to turn it over to Jason. And Jason, if you'd address that question in the Q&A as far as what the hybrid rye was, since you sourced the seed for that winter annual study.
Yep, I can do that. Hybrid rye is a new form of rye coming out of Europe. It is actually hybridized the same fashion as hybrid corn. Their work shows that it has higher grain yields than traditional rye, which is why they're breeding for it. So we were investigating the idea that if you have higher grain yields, are you going to see higher forage yields, better forage production? It's a higher management rye also, besides being hybrid. So it probably was heard a little bit that it's treated the same as traditional cereal rye with the same nitrogen rates. They would have recommended higher nitrogen rates for that crop, just like hybrid corn versus an older style. Non-hybrid corn, you're going to need more nitrogen to maximize corn production. So it's a cereal rye that has been hybridized to increase production as a feed grain in Europe. All right, welcome everybody to the portion on baleage. We're going to go through a lot of different things here tonight on making baleage, challenges that can arise. Garth mentioned that it really fits well with utilizing annual grass crops because it can be hard to get those dry. You think about winter annuals. Al mentioned that we want to make those in the boot stage. So we're looking at late April, early May. That's a hard time to get crops dry enough to make dry hay. Or if you're making oats, that's planted in early April or early August, going 60 days later, you're into October. It can be possible to make dry oats, but it can be quite difficult. So baleage fits very well into an annuals crop rotation, but it also has a very good fit into traditional haymaking. We could almost argue that it has a fit no matter where you want to go and can make your traditional hay high enough quality that you may not have to supplement with other commodities such as corn in order to get enough energy, or soybean meal for protein, because you can make your forage at the correct stage of growth due to the fact that we can decrease our weather window by at least 1 day. So when we look at forage and we start talking about storage, there's a few goals to think about. So when we're storing forage, we really have 3 goals. No matter what the system is, whether it's a bunker silo, an ag bag, an upright silo, baleage, or dry hay, we want a high recovery of nutrients, low harvest and storage costs, and obtain good animal performance. Utilizing baleage, we can meet all 3 of these goals if done correctly. So just to go over first, an introduction to baleage and some of the goals you need to keep in mind as we go through this presentation if you want to make good baleage, things that need to happen. You want to bale at that ideal moisture, ideally between 40 and 60 to 65%. Baling too wet can be very hazardous and actually lead to some toxic production of some toxins that can actually kill your livestock. It's the same as if you're making other silages, except for baleage is even more critical because we don't get as much oxygen excluded because their bales aren't packed as tight as chopped silage. Ideally, we're going to wrap that within 2 hours of baling. The sooner we wrap it, the sooner fermentation can begin, and we can start excluding oxygen, and we don't have bales that heat. So wet bales are going to start heating as soon as they're baled, and the hotter they get, the harder they are to ferment. We want to cover those bales with a minimum of 6 mils of plastic. We'll get into that in more depth, but each roll of plastic is typically 1 mil, and we want at least 6 mils of plastic on most of these bales. We want to make as tight and dense a bale as possible. We need to exclude all the oxygen we can from those bales. Bales actually ferment very slowly compared to silage. A typical chopped silage would be fairly stable, still not bunk stable, but fairly stable fermentation wise in 9 days to 2 weeks. They find that baleage may take 6 weeks to complete its fermentation process. If you end up baling between 25 to 40% moisture, the goal switches over from fermentation to oxygen exclusion and really temporary storage. You can bale between that 25 and 40%. That's really a rescue. You know, the hay's not going to get dry enough to make dry hay, or for some reason something broke and we weren't able to make baleage at the correct moistures. You can make it very well at 25 to 40% and make excellent feed. If that baleage is between 30 to 40%, you're going to get more of a caramelization action. You're going to lose some more nutrients during that caramelization, but you can store it very well and you won't have mold. Now, in this low moisture, because our goal is oxygen exclusion, if we don't use enough mils of plastic, enough wraps, mold can be very likely. If you're down close to that 25%, surface mold becomes more common. The more plastic we use, we improve that oxygen exclusion so we can store these bales up to about 6 months. So some keys to good quality baleage is really we have to make it at the correct maturity so we have enough fermentable carbohydrates in that plant. Some things we can't do with baleage and fermentation. Whoa, why did it do that? There we go. I was going for a pointer. All right, so some things we can't do through fermentation. We can't improve quality. And as fiber content increases, it's more difficult to get good fermentation. So what we're really aiming for is this head to budding stage in a grass crop or even in an alfalfa crop. Alfalfa, we can be successful into that bloom stage, mid-bloom, but really with a grass crop, once that head comes out, the ability to have enough fermentable carbohydrates in that plant goes down drastically. It makes it very hard to have high quality baleage. So if you're in that stage where you have head emergence and you're baling a grass crop, your goal becomes oxygen exclusion because you're probably not going to get proper fermentation. During that silage fermentation process, we start with a high pH. We go through anaerobic bacteria. Once they utilize all the oxygen out, we switch over to anaerobic, so there's no oxygen present. We have this spike in anaerobic bacteria, and the pH drops because of that anaerobic bacteria producing acids. And we end up down here in this stable phase with a low level of bacteria, a low pH, and a low temperature. If we don't wrap bales right away, you notice there's this initial on the red line, which is temperature, initial increase in temperature. The more that temperature increases, the more anaerobic bacteria actually you're going to have, and it takes longer then to bring that temperature down into a stable stage. And if it increases too much, you can actually start to kill off bacteria and it won't ferment properly. So some characteristics of good fermentation. If you go back, that anaerobic phase, we want that to be very short, because during that anaerobic phase, we're actually burning up plant sugars. So the longer from baling until wrapping that we have, the more plant sugars that are going to be utilized during that anaerobic phase. So we want to keep that as short as possible to maintain high quality and as many plant sugars as possible to utilize in fermentation. Because during that fermentation process, we have to have these plant sugars because they're going to be converted into lactic and acetic acid during the anaerobic phase, which is going to drop that pH ideally below 5. Temperature during fermentation should not exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. If temperature exceeds that 120, so if it takes 2 or 3 days, our bales may already be above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and that can actually kill these anaerobic bacteria, and we won't have the proper pH drop. You should have a pleasant odor when you open those bales. They should smell very tasty. They should have that fermented smell to them, like sauerkraut. A good fermented beverage should be the same smell you get from good baleage. If it's well fermented, you're going to have good bunk life and you'll have success feeding it. So when we look at making forages, there's a lot that can go wrong. So we mow it, we still have to weld it, and then we're going to probably, for baleage, we bale it, ferment it, feed it, and eat it. During that time, we have shrink, and we want to minimize the amount of shrink and losses throughout this process. So under ideal conditions, about 15% of forages harvested as hay or silage is going to be lost no matter what. But shrink can easily exceed 50%. So for easy numbers, if we have $100 a ton dry matter at 15% shrink, when that's eaten, we're really at about 118. If we make really poor baleage and we have to throw away some of that outer layer because it's white and moldy, we can easily exceed this 50% shrink, which takes our $100 a ton forage and turns it into $200 a ton forage. During shrink, a few things we can avoid. We're going to have these losses during respiration of 2 to 4%. If we have rain damage, we're going to have losses due to rain damage that we can't really control because Mother Nature sprung up on us. But one place where baleage happens to fit in quite well is if we have rain damage, so we mow, on day 1 it rains on it. We have one nice day on day 2, but it's supposed to rain again on day 3. We can actually get in there potentially on day 2, bale that hay as baleage, and sile it and keep it good, and we don't get that second rain event on it. It's going to have some quality loss, but it's going to be much better than if it got rained on again and turned into just sticks. Some things that we can do to promote rapid dry down. We can mow in the morning, ideally after the dew's off, lay in wide swaths with improved drying time, decreases that respiration loss. Vigorous conditioning on our mower conditioners helps to speed up drying, and then minimize mechanical operation. So mechanical is 2 to 10%. So if we're making dry hay and we have to ted it, we're going to have hay loss during tedding, and then we're going to re-rake it, and we're going to have hay loss during raking. And some of that loss is leaf loss. If you're making baleage, that leaf loss during raking is usually decreased because you're raking at a damp moisture. One challenge can be, though, with the wrong types of rakes, we can actually, because the hay is heavier, pick up more ash or soil into that, which is going to cause some more problems with the fermentation process. Shrink during storage. Typically, you'll see 2 to 3% storage loss. If you loss that is uncontrollable, there's going to be some spoilage. That uncontrollable loss is due to fermentation in fermented forages or sweating in dry hay. Spoilage then 0 to 100%. Ideally, we're going to be at 0, but you could see some spoilage. And one thing we shouldn't have to deal with due to baleage is weathering, because those bales are inside the plastic bale wrap. We won't have weathering losses unless we don't do a good job of managing those bales and our plastic gets damaged. So what's the effect of dry matter on forage storage? We want this normal hay crop. When we look at dry matter, about 32% to 50% dry matter is a good area to be. If we're making dry hay on the dry matter side, about 82, 83% dry matter can be stable hay, and anything from about 78 or so down is definitely going to spoil. We can put some propionic acid on it and things and help protect that when we're up here in this 80% to 75 to 80% range on dry matter, but that's not ideal for dry hay, and is where baleage really fits in then, is with this wetter hay crop. So we need to consider, if you're going to get into baleage, the baler that you're going to be using. If you're not making baleage currently, baler selection can be very important. And so some things to think about when you are baling is it's often recommended that you drive one gear slower, a little bit slower on a round baler. So the thinner those wraps on the round baler are, the denser the bale tends to be. So if we drive a little bit slower, we can make higher density bales. The higher density of that bale, the less oxygen that's present, the better fermentation process we'll have. Silage special round balers are not a requirement, but they definitely make a better bale and are going to last longer. So the silage specific balers are going to have heavier bearings, rollers, belt scrapers. What a lot of silage balers don't have, that they should if you want to make high quality baleage, is some sort of rotary cutter. That rotary cutter can increase bale weights by up to 300 or more pounds. They just make a denser bale. So the smaller the particle length, the more density you have, the denser the bale, the less oxygen, again, just leading to better fermentation. On these balers, sometimes you have the choice for a soft core or a hard core. When you're making those, you want to use a hard core. Do not use the soft core. That soft core leads to a smushy core in the middle, and that's an area where there's oxygen trapped in that bale and can lead to spoilage both internally and on the outside edges of that bale. If you're going to use a large square baler, they can work quite well and make a very dense bale for utilizing in baleage and wrapping. but it definitely helps to have a plastic liner in the bale chamber and in the pickup of those balers. It helps make the bale slide a lot easier. By sliding easier, you can increase the baler pressure, which then again increases that density of the bale. At the end of the day, what we're going for is as dense and tight a bale as possible. One thing you have to be aware of on any type of baler is you don't want to use treated sisal twine. So that treated sisal twine will actually have a reaction with the bale wrap plastic and will cause it to break down and then start to leak oxygen. So when you look at bale density, ideally you want a dense bale that's over 10 pounds per cubic foot. Just by increasing that bale density from 6 pounds per cubic foot to 8 pounds per cubic foot, we actually increase the bunk life of the bale by 12 hours just due to more complete fermentation. When you're looking at packing silage into an ag bag or a bunker, the ideal silage density, depending on what type of forage crop it is 15 to 44 pounds per cubic foot. The closer you are to that 15, 20 pounds per cubic foot in a bale, the better density and fermentation you have. If you look at the round bale here in this picture, while it's picked up with a bale squeeze, so it's squeezed some, you can start to see that it's saggy and elongated. That saggy, elongated round bale is just a sign that it's not really dense enough, and we may have some challenges with that bale fermenting properly just due to the high amount of air and oxygen in this trap. You can almost see a hole in the middle of that bale, which is that area for oxygen trapping. So when we think about the baleage timeline and why baleage fits in so nice in the spring, on day one, we're going to mow and lay that swath wide. Day two, we're going to rake it, ideally with a parallel bar rake or a rotary rake. Both of those can handle wet haze very well. The rotary rake is going to pick up a little bit less ash than that parallel bar, so we're going to have a little less soil contamination. Even better than that, but you probably won't have, unless baleage is one of your primary ways of making forage, would be if you had a windrow merger. They could pick up those wide swaths because the windrow merger is going to pick that up directly off the ground, drop it onto a belt and move it over instead of scuffing it across the ground. So when we get towards the end and we talk about some of the challenges with baleage, which is Clostridium, Botulism, and things like that, all of those, the initial bacterial spores, come from our soils. So the less soil contamination we have, the better. Wheel rakes are really not ideal for wet hay and can cause many challenges, especially if you're up around that 60% moisture. A lot of times wheel rakes don't do a good job of picking up that wet, dense hay. If you can bale mid-afternoon and then wrap that day, that's going to be your ideal goal. We really don't want to TED baleage because we're going to pick up dirt. If you're in a heavy annual crop, sometimes oats, cereal rye, things like that, sometimes you need to TED that crop in order to get it down to that 2-day window to get it dry. Just know you may have more dirt in there, which can cause some challenges that you're going to want to look at in a fermentation profile. On day 3, if you didn't bale on day 2, you're ideally going to bale by 40% moisture, unless for some reason you're going for that drier hay where you just are doing oxygen exclusion and not fermentation. So typically that's going to be in the morning once the dew's off, unless it's some sort of thick stemmed crop. Again, this particle size really matters, how dense we can make the bale. That's why these rotary cutters are so important if we're going to make a lot of baleage in a round baler. We want to make it short so we have good packing in that bale and good fermentation. The longer you make it does promote more chewing by the animals, but most of the time in a round baler with a rotary cutter, you're not going to make that particle so short like you can with a silage chopper that you can actually not have enough chewing and rumination with the particle length down at around like 1/4 of an inch. You don't get that short with these balers, so it's typically not a problem. Selecting the best bale wrapper. So we've decided we want to make baleage. We have a baler that's set up to do it. We have a timeline that we're going to be able to make it in, and we need to determine what type of wrapper is going to work best for our operation. Really, when it comes down to which wrapper is going to be best, it's really all about feed out and a little bit about what you have space for to store. So the first type of wrapper to look at here is an individual bale wrapper. So you size bales ideally to feed one every 2 days in the winter and one bale every day minimum in the summer, so that you have enough feed out fast enough that you don't get spoilage in the bunk. Individual wrappers are much slower than the line wrappers we're going to talk about here in a minute and can only do about 20 to 30 bales per hour. So if you're trying to make baleage and you want to be done at a certain time at night, you have to think about, if I start baling at 4, I probably won't start wrapping for an hour to 2 hours. So if I don't start wrapping till 6 and I only want to work till midnight, you can only do about 120 bales to maybe 180 bales in a day. Some other nice things about them, they can be stacked carefully. You can go up 3 or 4 or 5 high, depending how tall your loader is, or if you have a telehandler, you can possibly go higher. As long as you're careful and don't tear the plastic, you can stack these bales very nice so they take up less footprint on the ground, where with a line wrapper, each bale is sitting directly on the ground. It is also possible to transport for sale while wrapped. If you pick them up carefully with a bale squeeze, set them on your truck, you can actually sell these individually wrapped bales as long as whoever you're selling them to also has a bale squeeze to move them. If you're using line wrap, as soon as you cut that bale open, spoilage begins on the ends of those bales. So an individual wrapper is really ideal for operations feeding 50 head or less from that bale site. Wherever those bales are being pulled from, if you're going to have 50 head or less eating off of them, you probably want to go with an individual wrapper. If you're over 50 head, a line wrapper may make sense to your operation. And these individual wrappers are also more expensive to wrap on a per bale basis because they actually utilize about twice as much plastic as what a line wrapper does. And one other thing about individual wrappers, you must have a bale squeeze to move the bales when they come off the wrapper. You can't spear them. If you're going with a line wrapper, you can pretty much get by with only owning a bale spear. You wouldn't have to have a bale squeeze to pick up these bales and move them without damaging the plastic. So line wrappers, winter feed at least 1 bale per day. In summer, ideally, you want to be feeding a bale night and morning in order to keep up with possible spoilage. All bales do lay on the ground. Anywhere where these bales are contacting ground, you can have an increase in rodent problems, but you basically double your capacity, 40 to 50 bales per hour with most line wrappers. One thing that's critical is that uniformity between bales. So you can't see it great in this picture. I'll show you later in a picture, but think about where those round bales butt up or square bales, and they're being wrapped in a line. That butt up area is, again, an area where oxygen gets trapped that has to be eaten up in the fermentation process. And during that can actually not allow for as low a pH drop and as good a fermentation. Line wrappers are cheaper per ton. You need less tractors than the individual bale wrappers. And again, you don't have to have a spear. So one less piece of equipment. With individual bales, there tends to be less spoilage. They're much easier to move, much easier for inventory control than tubes. Tubes are just cheaper. And right here, you can see these bumps really well. Notice these bumps between bales, they're not nice and uniform. So that's a place where there's going to be some oxygen trapped at each one of those. Where up here on these individually wrapped bales, you can see that plastic's pulled so tight that there's actually no air trapped on the ends of those bales. Wrapping some large square bales, I've seen the bales that seemed like a really tight, dense bale actually shrink 6 inches to a foot when that plastic's being pulled and stretched onto those bales, making them even tighter than they were initially. We're going to make baleage. We really need to pick our storage location. You really want to wrap and store them very close to each other. Ideally, you're not loading them on a truck and hauling them to the place where they're going to be stored. You want to store them in a low risk of puncture area. So if you look at this bale storage pad, we don't see any trees nearby. There's actually a barn there that's helping to break the wind, helping to protect them a little bit. There's stone down here on the bottom. So if you store these bales under trees, while it may look like they're protected, those tree branches can fall and puncture the bale. And storing them in a field, say a corn stubble field, the corn stubble often punctures the bottom bales, which can be a problem. If we store on stone, we have a lower risk of rodent damage. If we were just to store these bales on the dirt, we have increased rodent problems. While you may think a hay crop, alfalfa crop, rodents aren't going to be interested in, don't put it past them. Anytime they find something to chew on, they just start chewing, make holes, oxygen gets in. If you're making a small grain crop, while you may have 8 mils of plastic on there to protect it, if there was some seed in there, they have magical noses that'll smell the seed through the plastic and they'll chew their way in to try to find it. You want to have year-round access so you can tell in the winter, this farm can get down here, pick up these bales without any problem due to a nice stone pad. And then you're going to check those weekly. I have a zoom in here on this bale, but if you look real close to the tip of my pointer, there's a little gash in this bale. When they picked up the bale that was sitting right beside it, Their bale spear happened to hit it, put a little tear in it, so that tear really should be taped up so that spoilage doesn't begin. That's really critical in the summer. In the winter, if you're going to feed that bale in a day or two, it's not as critical maybe to tape it up. If it's going to be 2 or 3 weeks, you really should tape that hole back shut. So we're going to make baleage. We need to think about what plastic we want to use. One thing that's really important is to rotate the stock of plastic. If we buy an entire pallet and don't use the whole thing in 1 year, or even if we just bought 2 rolls and we carry one over, we want that to be the first roll we use up the next year. So this plastic doesn't really last forever. It has a tackiness to it. That tackiness is really important for its ability to seal to itself as you put more layers on. Most of the plastic is 1 to 1.5 mils of polyurethane. When it stretches, it'll actually stretch. If it's 1 mil, it may stretch down so that each layer is only about 3/4 of a mil per layer due to stretching. There's 3 common colors. Occasionally you can find it in other colors, but most of the plastic comes in green, black, or white. If you're making wet hay, green and white tend to be the most common colors. White is definitely the most common overall. It reflects sunlight and reduces radial heat better than anything else. Some of the oxygen barrier films tend to be green just to set themselves apart. Oxygen barrier tends to be more expensive per mil, but with the same number of mils as polyurethane, you're going to have lower dry matter loss and also lower mold and spoilage. If you're going to make dry hay, so some guys are making dry hay and wrapping it under 20%. It's not common, but if you're going to do that, you don't want that hay to be below that 20% so it doesn't sweat. Ideally, you'd actually take that hay, set it in a barn for 2 to 4 weeks, and allow it to sweat before wrapping. And you're going to want to use black plastic. So the black absorbs heat and stops surface mold because it gets hot right there along the surface below the plastic, so that bale doesn't sweat out and collect condensation on the outside edge of the bale between the plastic and the bale. It actually helps to drive the moisture in. And you want to cut some slits in the bottom of those bales ideally so that they can breathe a little bit. But you really want to watch for surface mold on these bales. You may have to throw a portion of them away if they go through that sweating process. So when we're making these dry hay bales, bale temperature becomes critical. So we really want to see those bales, and even during fermentation, we want to keep bales below 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Between 120 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit, that's that caution area. And no matter if it's wrapped or if it's in a barn, when hay gets over 160 degrees Fahrenheit, fire becomes likely. Those bales are dangerous. We want to watch them carefully and make sure they're not stacked close to any other buildings. And definitely have your fire department's phone number on standby in case they catch on fire. So this is showing that wet bales heat. So when you look, you want to keep this heating degrees, days under about 1,000 or less, really 500. It should stay under that, 1,000 if we use propionic acid. But when we get up here, whether it's propionic acid or not, at this 30% or better, which is kind of that minimum moisture, we want at least 30%. If we're going to wrap these bales, they're not going to ferment very well. We can use oxygen exclusion. Neither acid or control is really decreasing the amount of heating. You notice this black line is running just a little bit below the gray control, up to about 25%. So that 25% propionic acid really isn't working anymore. And that's when we switch over to looking at using plastics. Hot bales rot, anything over 30% moisture, even with propionic acid. You notice a decrease in dry matter recovery the more heating degree days we had. So timing the wrap is very important. The closer to baling that we wrap these bales, the lower the temperature is going to be. Remember that we really want to keep them under 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So this red line right here that I'm outlining is wrapped within a couple hours of baling. And this graph's a little bit confusing because it looks like they all start at day 1. Day 1 is wrapping day. So when we go here to 24 hours, day 1 on the red and day 1 on the yellow line is actually day 2 for yellow. So you notice that even though we wrap on day 2, by day 3, waiting 24 hours to wrap these bales, we hit that magical 120 number. But then we start to decline And by day 9 or 10, we're back to that same temperature as if we had wrapped immediately. But if we wait 2 days, so 48 hours to wrap, by the time we get these bales wrapped, they have now spent, till their temperature starts to decrease, about 5 days around 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're getting really close to that temperature. They're at risk of killing off our good bacteria. We've had burned a lot of sugars out of them through aerobic digestion of the bacteria that are in there. If we wait another day, we get out here, we're about 6 or 7 days until we decrease bale moisture, bale temperature. If we never wrap them at all, we never hit 160 with these wet bales, but we got up to 150, and those bales just stayed hot the entire time out 3 weeks later. So we want to really wrap within 24 hours minimum. 0 hours within 2 to 6 hours is that ideal amount of time. So these bales really never heat up. Because when we get up here to 120 degrees, we're playing with fire of not having proper fermentation because the bales got hot and we killed off the bacteria that we wanted. Another study looking at days from baling to wrapping. So we're going to look at some of those important nutrients. So NDF is going to be in the gray here, and then TDN, which is your energy, is in the black. And 0 days is wrapped right away. Day 1, we see a slight increase in NDF, so it's not going to be quite as digestible, and a slight decrease in energy. And energy just continues to decrease. If it takes us 3 days to wrap, we lost 3 or 4% of our TDN out of that hay. And when we look at NDF, we increased NDF about 4% by taking 3 days to wrap. That may not seem like a lot, but that really matters at the end of the day for the value of that hay and how much you may end up having to buy supplemental nutrients. So we know we need to wrap the hay as soon as possible. How much plastic do we need to put on? So this is all wrapped in good time, same day as baling, wrapped with anything from no wrap up here in pink, 2 mils in red, 3 mils in yellow, 4 mils in blue. So you don't see a big difference here between 3 and 4 mils. And then you jump to 6 mils as this light blue, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15 mils. And what we're looking at is how well we do at keeping that internal temperature low and getting it to drop as quick as possible. That drop in temperature is often tied to that switch over from aerobic to anaerobic bacteria and that start of fermentation and good fermentation. So that's where that 6 mils comes in. So by putting 6 mils on, by day 9, we have that temperature drop to about outdoor temperature, 80 degrees. We can put a little bit more on, 8, 9, 10 mils, but we don't see a huge difference. But the challenge is, and why we'll see here in a minute, another one of my slides, we often recommend 8 mils, is it's after that last stem pokes through is where we really want to start counting mils, not the total layers we put on. Up here at 3 or 4, running over 90 degrees, we're not really dropping. We're not going to get good fermentation there. The red line, only 2 mils. We see some bouncing around here, getting close to that 120 degrees, slightly dangerous temperature. Type of plastic also matters with the number of mils we put on. So I mentioned earlier that oxygen barrier plastic. So oxygen barriers here in black versus the gray, which is a non-oxygen barrier polyurethane plastic, and the pH drop. So we're going really for an ideal pH of forage is down here at 5 or less. For baleage, if we can get 5.5, we're doing pretty well a lot of times. So we can notice that with the non-oxygen barrier film, 2 mils is definitely not enough. 4 mils, we're getting there, but it just gets a little bit better here at 6 and 8. It's hardly a noticeable difference, but it's enough to matter when it comes to that fermentation. But with the oxygen barrier film, we're really getting the best pH drop, and it's pretty much stays constant from 4 mils to 8 mils. The biggest challenge there at 4 mils would be if you're wrapping a stemmy crop with oxygen barrier film and it starts poking through, you're going to need to up that to 6 or 8. Or if you don't have good overlap, not actually getting 4 mils on across the entire bale. I'm looking at fermentation time. So this is a 61% moisture bale. And how long does it take for it to ferment in days? And in here we're comparing chopped silage in black versus baleage. So you notice they start off the same pH at day 0. By day 9, if we're going for at least a drop below 5 pH, and an ideal drop is going to be below 4.5, By 9 days, the baleage hasn't dropped a whole lot. We've lost about 2/10 for baleage, but the chopped silage is all the way down here, almost a 4.5. Just due to that small particle size and that dense packing, it doesn't take as long for it to switch over from aerobic to anaerobic fermentation. And then when you get out to 60 days, the baleage still hasn't, in this study, still hadn't quite made 5 pH, but the chopped silage is down here at 4.5. So when it comes to fermentation, chopping is better. This baleage could have been improved if they would have had some sort of rotary cutter in the baler. But really, for most of us, unless we want to own a whole nother line of equipment, chopping forage isn't ideal for our operations. But by using baleage, we can store this feed very well. So part of the how many mils to use story comes down to what moisture are we wrapping at. So if we're wrapping at 20% or less, we're not trying to ferment these bales. Our whole goal is just to keep it dry. So we're looking at 2 layers of black plastic with small vertical slits cut between the bales or in the bottom of the bale. When we're in at 20 to 30% moisture, you could have fermentation, but it's not going to be ideal. Some mold growth is quite possible. Our entire goal with 20 to 30% hay is to ensure oxygen exclusion. So we're going to want to up that wrap at 20 to 30% hay. We're going to want probably 8 mils on there. So we get better oxygen exclusion and protection of those bales, and we can store them very well about 6 months. 30 to 40%. We get a little bit better chance of fermentation, but there's still some chance of mold growth. It's really not that ideal moisture. So we want to use, again, 8 layers of plastic so we ensure that oxygen exclusion again. When we get up to 40 to 60%, that's going to be the ideal for baleage production and fermentation. Because of fermentation, we still have to exclude oxygen, but when fermentation works right, we can decrease that to about 6 layers of 1 mil film, so about 6 mils total. When you get up to 60 or 70%, we're getting into that too wet. Spoilage can definitely occur. We can have low palatability. There's a lot of different bacteria that can grow very well at these higher moistures, and we have some real concerns about that Listeria and different things, botulism, and we want to use 8 layers to make sure we have really good oxygen exclusion again. And then if it's over 70, we just need to sit back and wait. It's got to dry down more. Over 70%, it's not going to ferment right. It's not going to store well. We're going to have poor quality feed. Back to that targeting the correct maturity, really important. So we have the right amount of fermentable carbohydrates. Sugars are going to decrease with maturity. Small grains, we really want to cut in that boot stage. If we're doing a late fall harvest, I'll talk quite a bit about oats. Have some experience harvesting oats into November. So when we're harvesting in November, even if we can get that 40 to 60% moisture forage, oxygen exclusion becomes key, especially if you look across this picture, you can see frost. At those cold temperatures, bacteria move very slowly in the cold. Fermentation is going to be very slow. While spoilage is also slow, we really want to look at probably 8 mils of plastic on these late fall cut forages because they're not going to really ferment properly until spring when they begin to warm up. Ideally, we would actually have them fed before that spring warm up. Talked a lot about fermentation. It's the key to this whole process. So we take these plant sugars, and the plant sugars are utilized by the anaerobic bacteria to decrease the oxygen until the oxygen's all gone. And then we start into the fermentation stage where we have the anaerobic bacteria that don't like oxygen that come in. They ferment it, and they're going to produce that lactic acid. The lactic acid causes the stark pH drop, and then the bacteria continue until they die off, and then we have a stable forage. In an ideal system, that's only going to take about 14 days. But again, in our baleage, that may be 6 weeks or better until it's totally fermented and stable. A forage crop that doesn't ferment very well, it's going to have a skunky smell to it. Typically, when we're at too wet, that 60% or greater on baleage, definitely over 70%. We're going to have poor fermentation. If we have too much oxygen, we can have poor fermentation. And we get that skunky smell because there's butyric acid present. And it's also not going to have very good bunk life to it. One way we can actually improve baleage, There's a few studies out there, a lot of guys making high quality alfalfa and chopping it utilize inoculants. It's not thought of quite as much for guys making baleage, but inoculants can actually help with baleage. One challenge with it is you don't have as small particles, so it's harder for the bacteria to get into the internal portion of that plant to work and ferment properly. But inoculants can help, and a lot of times you'll actually use a mix of inoculants. So they make special alfalfa inoculants and special small grain inoculants. But there's some studies that show by mixing those two for baleage, especially if you have a mixed alfalfa grass crop, it'll work better. And there's a couple types of inoculants. There's the front end kind that improves slow fermentation, and that's really what we want for baleage. And then there's back end inoculants that improve bunk life. We're not worried about that quite as much. There could be some concern there, but improving this fermentation is really where we can change baleage and make better feeds if we're using inoculant. So that lactic acid bacteria, lab inoculants on alfalfa, fermentation response is quite likely with an alfalfa crop, not as likely with a grass crop. Alfalfa is a very high dollar crop, so you can have a high return on investment by using those inoculants on alfalfa and baleage. So how are things recovered? Again, comparing a silage trial to a hay trial, looking at pre-storage versus post-storage. So we don't see a lot of change in NDF in these silage trials, but we do see a huge change. So if we're going to test baleage, we really want to test it before feed out, not when it goes in, to look at what these nutrient values are. Here the NDF went from about 37 up to about 47 in this trial in baleage. We had about a 10% increase. Silage, it went up, but only about 2%. Over here, silage, it went down a little bit, not statistically significant. But again, in this trial in baleage, it went from about 45 up to 47 or 48. So again, we had a small increase in NDF in the baleage compared to the silage trial. There was a better pH drop in this hay trial too, compared to hay trial 1. So you didn't see as much increase in NDF. Feed out timing after wrapping is pretty important. We're feeding this baleage out here. It's a nice caramelized bale because it was really made too wet or too dry, but it was a rescue treatment. So it was hay that got rained on, was able to go in, bale it the day after the rain event, and then when it rained the next day, that hay was off the field. So percent moisture, if we're over 60%, we really want to feed that forage within 3 months. If we're under 40%, we want to feed it within 6 months. And if we're in that sweet spot of 40 to 60%, we can probably go 8 months, possibly 12 months with that baleage, that it'll stay good in the package. The plastic on baleage tends to degrade a little bit faster than ag bag plastic, and it definitely isn't sealed quite as well as a good upright sealed silo. Don't feed spoiled silage. Don't feed spoiled baleage. Spoiled silage reduces intake and digestibility. It's been known to kill animals. We want to throw it away. So when we look at dry matter intake as percent of body weight, if we don't have any spoilage, we're about a little over 2.3% of body weights for dry matter intake. If we just go to 10% spoilage, that drops to 2.1. That decrease in intake can be the difference between an animal maintaining weight and an animal losing weight on our forage. You don't even have to be able to detect mycotoxins. Just that moldy hay can actually cause animals not to eat as efficiently. So when we look over here, dry matter intake, feeding good hay in blue versus moldy in that gray color, we go from about 12 pounds to 9 pounds just because of a little bit of mold. And we see a slight decrease in average daily gain because we're feeding moldy hay. So we want to throw that moldy part of the bale away. So what happens if we feed bad hay? So these are mostly if we make the hay too wet. There's a few diseases we can come across. The first one we're going to look at today is botulism. So typically in forage, that's botulism. It's Clostridium botulism type B. It's actually naturally found in the soil. When we're raking, tedding, baling the hay, we pick a small amount of that up. If you're making that rained on hay as a rescue treatment, that rain splash can actually splash some of that soil up onto the hay, make it an even bigger problem. So you really want to be cautious of Clostridium. So if we have good fermentation, so if we have anaerobic fermentation and a pH drop that gets the pH below 4.5, that'll kill off the botulism. But if we have a pH above 4.5, we could have botulism spores present. Those spores are going to be in the vegetative state where they're producing toxins. If we can get that good pH drop below 4.5, we'll kill off the botulism clostridium toxins. So what happens with botulism? Weak muscles, typically it's 2 to 5 days until you have a downer animal. You'll start to notice them once they're down. There's a significant chance of death due to paralysis. So botulism will actually make the muscles not work properly, so we can have paralysis of the diaphragm, so then they can't breathe. Dehydration is very common, or other just complications from being a downer. Down in that picture, you'll often see sometimes before they're down or once they're down, they get this decreased tongue and jaw tone. They don't have very good handling of their tongue. It often sticks out to the side of the mouth as that disease progresses. There are some ways to treat it. It's a little bit, if we catch it before they're down, there's some treatment in cattle. Sheep and goats, on the other hand, if anybody here is raising those and thinking about feeding baleage, it's really important for you to make sure you make it properly and you get that pH drop, you get oxygen exclusion, because botulism can kill a lot quicker in sheep and goats, and so can Listeria. So Listeria is another soil-borne bacteria. Feeding too many bales at once is often what causes Listeria problems. So bales begin to rot and spoil in the feeder. To kill Listeria, we need a pH drop below 5. So we can kill Listeria with that pH drop below 5. If our pH stays above 5 and we feed too many bales, they'll start to spoil in the feeder, and that's when we have Listeria issues. Some typical signs of Listeria: leaning to one side, stumbling, circling in one direction, facial nerve paralysis. You'll start to see one side of the face start to droop. They start drooling. They're holding their jaw down. The very common one is the head's going to be tilted to the side. With cattle, if we have early intervention, we can a lot of times save cattle. Sheep and goats, again, they die a lot easier to this disease, only have about 25% survival rate, even if caught early. Another thing with Listeria is if it doesn't go to the brain and the nervous system, it can get to the eye, and it's going to look very similar to pink eye. You notice that white looking eye. So you'll get tearing, blinking, sensitivity to light. That bluish white corneal is a sign that you have silage eye, which is Listeria toxin that has gone to the eye. So then there's also some chances for bacterial and fungal contamination. Typically, this is when we make forages too dry. We can have increased amounts of mold, yeast, and bacterial growth. Those can actually circulate through the blood and get into the placenta. And when they're in the placenta, they can cause abortion if you're feeding a moldy feed during the last trimester of pregnancy. If it's a bacillus fungi, so bacillus toxin, tends to cause abortion within the last month of pregnancy. And if an animal's born and it's had bacillus circulating through the placenta, a lot of times that calf will die within 24 hours. So assessing Baleage fermentation is absolutely critical. When running your forage test, you can just run a fermentation profile on it. Some goals you're looking for: you want that pH drop below 4.5, at least 2.5% lactic acid, greater than 5% total dry matter, total acids on a dry matter basis. Volatile fatty acid score over 5 would be ideal. These numbers often don't happen with baleage. It doesn't mean you have bad forage. It just means that you may want to run extra tests on baleage just to make sure that's going to be safe to feed to your livestock. Not making it too wet, though, is absolutely critical. If we make it too wet, we're never going to achieve these goals. Too dry is actually better than too wet. This here is just a printout of a Baleage fermentation analysis. Lactic acid, the goal was greater than 3. We're at 0.74. This here is the major concern. Butyric acid, 2.38. This feed had a skunky smell to it. It didn't even smell like something you would want to eat. The cattle would not have wanted to eat it. It smelled bad enough. You would have had refusals due to them not wanting it. pH, we really wanted to drop below 4.5. We weren't quite below 5. So at that 5.1 pH, we could have had both listeriosis and clostridial issues. Volatile fatty acid score, you wanted over 5. This one didn't even make 1. So there's a lot of challenges, but by running this fermentation profile, you at least know what you have to improve your operation into the future. Using manure on forage. There's been a lot of work done looking at using manure to improve forage growth. It's a great way to get nutrition that, the NP and K, the nutrients your forage crop needs, but it's not a great idea if you want to make silages, especially baleage. We know in baleage, we're not going to have that pH drop like we really want as fast as we want. And when we think about manure, we're putting that clostridial and botulism and listeriosis onto that plant's leaves. Even if we make it just after cutting, there's a little bit on the stem, and we're going to pick more of that up in the baling process. So by putting cattle manure onto hay, found higher clostridial counts with any timing of that manure application, whether it was right after cutting, 4 days after cutting, it didn't matter. And the clostridia stayed higher in the post-ensiled versus pre-ensiled. But butyric levels luckily didn't change, but that clostridium is a real problem. One thing you can do is there are some vaccinations to help with Clostridium type B and type C toxins, but really we just want to keep it out of our forage. So I've mentioned many, many times throughout this presentation how critical moisture level is. One challenge though is until it's in the bale, and a lot of our dry bale moisture testers aren't really designed to work well in that 40 to 60% moisture range. And, and unless you started baling, how do you know what the moisture is? One way to do this is go steal your wife's microwave, make sure she's out of the house because you're going to stink the entire house up with the process, or just get a microwave for the shop would be a little bit more ideal, and do a microwave test for moisture. You're going to need a gram scale because this calls for a 100-gram sample. You put it on a microwave safe plate, and you must put a cup of water in the microwave. If you forget the cup of water, you can probably kiss the microwave goodbye because there's a good chance to catch it on fire. So what you do is you weigh the plate on the gram scale, and then you add 100 grams of forage. Take that sample of forage, a good pair of scissors, and cut up the forage into about 1-inch pieces. Make sure you get the leaves, the entire plant. This will work for anything from alfalfa to sorghum sudan grass to corn silage. If you're looking to make corn, you can get an estimate of what moisture is by cutting the sample up, maybe cut it up in a bucket so you cut up more than you need, and just place 100 grams on that plate in the microwave. Be sure to put the cup of water in the microwave and then run the first time for about 5 minutes on high heat. You're going to weigh the sample, refill the water cup. You don't want to run out of water. Again, that'll burn up the microwave. And then microwave for another 2 minutes and weigh again. And then you keep microwaving for 2 minutes, making sure you have a full cup of water until the weight of the forage doesn't change by more than a gram. So then you take 100 grams minus that final weight in grams, and that's how much water, how much moisture was in that sample. Then you know what it is that you're going to go, what it is when you start baling, so that you can have high quality baleage instead of it being too wet or too dry. Shrink during feed out. It's not as important for baleage because we're going to feed an entire bale at a time. Ideal feed out rates and what wrapper you chose depends on the number and type of animals that you have, percent baleage in the diet, bale size, bale density. And remember, with individually wrapped bales, in the winter, you want to feed about one a day, one bale per day or 2 days. If you are in a line wrapper in the summer, 2 bales a day, 1 bale in the winter. There's a lot of guys that get away with feeding, especially in the winter, a bale every 2 or 3 days. 1 week is about pushing it in the winter. If you're in the summer, an individual bale. If you're in individual wrap situation where you're not going to start to have end spoilage, you can probably push that to about 3 days, but that's maximum. You really need good fermentation, and that's where you start to run into some chances of listeriosis or something because of starting to rot in the bunk. Again, fermented forages work very well. Harvest on day 2, we actually decrease wheel damage, which improves yield. We decrease that potential for rain damage. The equipment to make wet hay is often heavier. That baleage, ideal moisture, 40 to 60%, minimum of 6 mils. 1 wrap, 1 mils needed to exclude oxygen after the stem poke. So silage, though, we're going to get better fermentation throughout if we can use silage than baleage. If we have holes, they must be fixed. So up here's a hole in a bale that really needs taped as soon as we find it. Down here, this isn't a hole, but this is a challenge we can get with baleage. So that outside layer, the plastic's pointed up, that can collect water, and then that water freezes in the winter, and I've seen it actually cut the bales and lead to spoilage. Typically, the water doesn't make it inside the bale, it just pools down here in the bottom pocket, but it can be a real problem that leads to spoilage. And one challenge, especially with individually wrapped square bales. If you're using round bales, they shed the water a lot better and you don't have that issue. But it's one challenge you run into with square bales. So what's the economics? What's the dollars and cents to making baleage? So one roll of polyurethane films, about $85 per roll. I've seen it range recently from about $75 to $95, depending when you buy it. Buying early, a lot of times in the winter, you can get it down around that $75 per roll, where if you buy in season, you're closer to $90 to $95. A line wrapper, it's going to cost you about $3 to $4 per bale in plastic, and you can get 25 to 30 bales out of a roll. An individual wrapper, you're looking at $5 to $8 per bale, and you're only going to get 10 to 15 bales per roll. By being able to harvest in shorter windows, though, herds over 50 head were actually found to improve farm profits by owning a bale wrapper, by harvesting every cutting at the ideal time instead of having some cuttings not be harvested in time, being too mature and low quality. So bale wrappers, they may not improve quality if you had the perfect weather, but due to poor weather that we often have here in Ohio, a bale wrapper allows you to harvest at higher qualities so you can decrease purchased feeds onto the farm. So what are those keys again to high quality baleage? Use a minimum of 6 mils of plastic, more when wrapping anything that's pokey, and more when outside that ideal moisture range. That ideal moisture range is 40 to 60%. You want to keep bales as dense as possible. In an ideal world, you're going to wrap them within 2 hours. You're going to select the wrapper based on feed out speed, not based on what the neighbor down the road has for a bale wrapper, but what you need to be able to feed out the correct amount of bales for the weather you're going to be feeding in. Patch any holes as soon as they arise. Plastic disposal, well, that can be challenging. Talk to your local recycling agency or find a way to dispose of it. Many landfills will take it, or whatever creative fashion you can come up with to dispose of it. Basically, baleage is a pain. We should just chop it. Wait, hold on. That takes 5 or 6 more pieces of equipment and about $50,000 to $100,000 investment to chop it. If you're going to make dry hay, baleage can be made very well. We just have to be respectful of that moisture, make as dense of bales as possible, and wrap them as soon after we've baled them so we get the best fermentation possible. And they can work for cattle, sheep, goats. I even know somebody that feeds them to horses. So it is possible to make very high quality baleage. And if anybody's interested, a well-wrapped bale floats. Any questions?
Thank you, Jason. Can we silage wrap sorghum?
Yes, we can. I work with quite a few growers that silage wrap sorghum. Both big squares individually wrapped, rounds individually wrapped, and tube wrapped. It would be more ideal if sorghum, if you had a rotary cutter in that baler, even more important than a small grain or an alfalfa crop in order to get that bale dense enough. You can definitely have some challenges with fermentation because you don't have the oxygen excluded like you would in that thick stemmed crop. But if you can make a dense bale, you can silage wrap sorghum and it works quite well. Of course, I don't know if you're working with sorghum now or not, but there are some challenges with feeding sorghum out through a bale feeder. There's higher waste there just because of that long plant. But it's definitely possible to wrap it, but that is a stemmy crop. We usually shoot for 8 mils on it because quite often you blow through a couple spots in that bale in the first mill or two.
The same can be said for oats too. I didn't get time. I had a few more slides in my presentation on discussing that with oats, but same things that Jason just noted, but we have found in dealing with oats, at least on our farm, the drier you can get them and closer to that 40%, the better off. If you try to bale oats and wrap it at 60%, you are going to experience some spoilage. We found we prefer to even go closer to 35% than we would to 55%. just seems to keep better and easier to handle bales as well. But same type of thing as Jason said, if you can get access to a baler with a cutter on it, definitely going to be worth your while. No matter what type of bale feeder you're using, you're going to experience some loss with, especially with feeding wet wrapped oats.
Yeah, certainly can echo the sentiments on the cutters and the baler. Yeah, I think Dr. Fluharty said it multiple times in his presentations. He'd pay 30% more for those bales. Question from Richard from down in, I believe, Adams County. Should inline bales be wrapped facing north to south?
Oh, there's various opinions about the direction bales should be wrapped based on sunlight. Just kind of like, should we plant all of our corn north, south, east, west to get the sun down the rows or across the rows to decrease shadowing? I've seen them pointed every which direction without any major problems, as long as you make the forage correctly. If you're running that row north to south, it gets sun on both sides. If you run the row east to west, well, it gets sun down it, but not on the sides as much. I don't think you have to define if it goes east, west, north, south. It just depends where you're going to put them and what you're going to have good access to. Yeah, we just had a panel, or one of our attendees put in the chat that four wraps of net wrap and an extra wrap of plastic on sorghum, sedans. The cows love it. It ferments well. Basically, that key is you just have to get it wrapped up well and get enough layers on it that you don't have stems poking through, have about 6 mils or better over that last stem that poked through. It just depends how stemmy it is. I don't have a lot of experience. My growers do. I mean, I work with growers that use net wrap. We big square, and I've big squared sorghum, sedans. It's all possible. And cows absolutely love silage bales. They love the smell of it, taste of it. I didn't have that in my presentation, but they will consume more dry matter feeding them silage bales than dry bales. So plan for it when you're putting up your forage. They'll also grow more because they're consuming more dry matter, more digestible dry matter. So you're going to need a little bit more hay, actually, if you're feeding them forage hay, silages. We had another comment. Christine said to tell us about the air fryer method. You can search online, but you can dry forages to do a moisture test in the air fryer. I personally don't have one, and I'm pretty sure if I took one out of somebody's house, they wouldn't be too happy, because the microwave that got used one time for moisture testing was never allowed back in the house. Pretty sure the air fryer would have the same fate.
Yeah, nice thing about the air fryer, less risk for cooking or burning that forage. But yeah, once you use it, probably ought to stay in the shop. I think this is a grazing question here. Can we graze or forage cattle on sorghum fields? Al? I think
We can. Jason might have a little more experience with this too, but we're going to have the same concerns that we would as we get late into the season with frost and potential toxicity.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big concern. As long as you're don't have frost potential and don't have drought conditions, you can graze sorghum just fine. If you have either one of those situations, there's nitrate concerns. One difference between baleage and chopped silage with sorghums is if you do have a nitrate problem, generally in chopped silage, it dissipates well. In baleage, you don't always get as good of dissipation of the nitrates as you do in chopped silage. It doesn't mean it isn't possible. I've seen silage or baleage go from too high in nitrates, and those nitrates with enough time in the bale dissipate and are perfectly fine to feed with later testings. It just takes longer than what we've seen with chopped silage.
The other consideration on grazing any of these forages is figuring out what we need, sampling that forage as it stands, and figuring out dry matter content no matter what time of year you're going to graze it, And if possible, management intensive grazing and offering those cows only what they need on a daily basis, or restricting it as much as we can. If we can move that fence daily, great. Because otherwise, if you turn them out into 10 cows into a 20-acre field, you're going to get a lot of waste. If we can strip graze it and treat it like a feed bunk, we're going to get much better utilization. We're also going to get much better consistent spread of that manure and traffic patterns on that field. And it's going to be make a whole lot more sense economically.
A lot of good questions.
I see another comment there, Garth. It's not necessarily a question, but someone commented they feed one dry bale with one wet bale. And we too have experienced success with that on our farm, especially depending on the moisture content of the forage and what it is. I had mentioned earlier that we strive to get our oats wrapped at 40% or even a little bit less. Sometimes Mother Nature dictates otherwise. This year we wrapped several oat bales at 60%, and we tried to use those up early in the feeding period as we could, as we did expect some spoilage. But you can also, because the cows will overconsume because they like it so much, you can also run into some situations of turning yourself backwards economically. But we have found offering a dry bale of first cutting with a wet wrapped bale and kind of training those cows that they're going to need to empty both feeders before they're replenished. We can do so. And even though the cows may be psychologically hungry at some points during that strategy, they will be meeting their nutrient requirements. Just need to be prepared as you get out of the skid steer to put the bale in and make sure the gates are closed as they come after you.
Yeah, certainly a good way to capitalize on, maybe balanced nutrients with that first cutting hay. Yep, and that's what Richard just commented there. Helps feed out some lower quality dry hay.
Absolutely, but all of that strategy is only as good as the information we have on hand, and that goes back to what we've preached at prior meetings. You must forage test, and you must forage test every cutting and every field, so you know exactly which bales to mix when you're approaching it in this manner.
In the question and answer box, our feed nutritionist mentioned feeding one dry, one wet due to pH. How crucial is this?
I'm curious what pH problem they're worried about. If they're worried about the fact that your wet hay doesn't have a low enough pH drop for good fermentation, it's possible that they're having you feed that because dilution's the solution to increased bacterial counts. So by feeding one of each, if you have dry hay with low bacteria counts, your wet hay didn't ferment properly, and you have a pH on it, but not a actual fermentation profile, or didn't run bacterial tests on it, you can blend the two, and that will help dilute out some of those toxins. If you're feeding a wet and a dry bale because you're worried about the pH of the hay going into the rumen, that's not really going to be a problem. Those rumen bacteria will adjust just fine to a 4 or 4.5 pH in the silage and thrive on it without a problem. An ideal world, when you're feeding one dry bale and one wet bale, or trying to blend high quality and low quality forage together, if you ever come across an auction with a good vertical mixer wagon or a good bale chopper, getting that so you can actually blend the two some while putting it in two different round bale feeders works great. Even better answer is if you blend it for them so they don't have a choice.